Welcome to Encountering Scripture, a series designed to help you create a personal and intimate understanding of the upcoming Sunday Scripture. This week we have the beginning of Advent, the first Sunday of Advent. And so in order to get started, we're going to be going to the end of the Gospel of Mark. Mark chapter 13, verses 24 through 37. There's a lot loaded into this Scripture reading. It's known as the little apocalypse of Christ. And so it's a dense piece that you could spend weeks, if not years, breaking down. But we're going to try to do that, and by doing 3 readings of the Scripture. The first one will just allow you to listen to the Scripture and let whatever comes to you come. The second reading will dig a little bit deeper into the details. And then the third reading will just go back to using our imagination, and the things that we've learned up to that point, allow that to resonate and allow us to learn and know the Scripture in an even deeper way. So I'm looking forward to going on this journey. Let's get started with Mark chapter 13, verses 24 through 37. In this first reading of the Scripture, I invite you just to listen. You can read the words as I go, but just listen to the Scripture and allow it to whatever comes up for you, to allow it to resonate within you. So hear now the words of the Gospel of Mark. But in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. And the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the 4 winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heaven. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But about that day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. Therefore, keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake. Having heard this Scripture for the first time, what is it that resonates within you? What is it about this Scripture stuck out for you? Maybe you got stuck on a word or a phrase. Make a note of what those words and phrases are so that you can go back and continue to reflect on them. For the second reading of the Scripture, we're going to dig in a little bit deeper. In order to do this, I'm going to break it up into 3 parts. There's really 3 parts to this Scripture reading. Verses 24 through 27, and then 28 through 31, and then finally 32 through 37. So those are the 3 different parts of this Scripture that we will break up and dig into in a little bit more detail. So here now the first section of this reading, 24 through 27. But in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the 4 winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. So I think the first thing that we need to identify is the type of literature that we're reading, the type of Scripture that we're reading. And I've said a couple of times this is Jesus' apocalyptic vision. It's known as the little apocalypse of Jesus. And so there's some things we should know about apocalyptic literature. The first is that apocalypse or revelation simply means to uncover or reveal. So we know about the book of Revelations. That's also known as the Apocalypse of John, and it's about uncovering or revealing something. The second piece about apocalyptic literature is that it usually contains 3 parts: God's coming or arrival, cosmic disturbances, and eschatological judgment and salvation. Eschatology is simply the study of the end times. It's about the end times. And it's very focused on actually the present. Martha Simmons, a scholar in the New Testament, says that eschatology is where the sweet by and by meets the nasty here and now. Let me say that again. Eschatology is where the sweet by and by meets the nasty here and now. So the study of the end times is about the past meeting the present. And so even though it's about the end times, it's really about the present and the now, which it leads us into our third point about apocalyptic literature. It is generally used to encourage the audience in which it is addressed, who's living amidst a difficult situation. So even though we tend to think about apocalyptic literature taking place in the future, it's really about the now, and it's speaking to an audience that is living in a difficult situation in the now. So if we think about the New Testament, the difficult situation was the Roman Empire colonizing Jerusalem, colonizing Israel, taking over control and really being harsh and to put it lightly, harsh on the people of Israel during this time. But it's even more than that. So if you think about the context of the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Mark is actually the first gospel that we have. It's the oldest gospel that we have. Even though it's not the first in order, it's the first in which one was written. And scholars generally believe that the other gospels took off from the Gospel of Mark and incorporated some parts of it and had their own uniquenesses, and so does Mark, but it was the first gospel. And the Gospel of Mark was generally believed to be recorded somewhere between 68 and 72 CE, AD, as it's traditionally known. And at this time, what we need to know is that Jerusalem was being destroyed in this time of history. The Jewish war had been going on, and Rome finally came down and brought an army down, surrounded Jerusalem, tried to starve the city, and then it was killing people that were trying to escape it. And finally, it just moved in and razed the city. It completely tore down the city of Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and it was a really dramatic, traumatic time in the history of Jerusalem. It was the destruction of the second temple. And so that is the context of the gospel when it was written. And so this is, so that stays in context with where this takes place in the gospel. Jesus has just cleared the temple, taught in the temple, and that he had left the temple and was talking with his disciples, and he talked about the destruction of the temple, saying this temple would be destroyed. And the disciples were asking him when it would be destroyed and what the signs they should look for that the destruction was upcoming. And so we see Jesus then going into this apocalyptic piece. So it speaks to the present, and I think it's important for us to realize that that's what apocalyptic literature does, is that it speaks to a present reality, difficult times, letting us know that God is still in control of the moment. And so I think that's important for us to know about apocalyptic literature. And we see that in noting on the Son of Man, which is in verse 26. The Son of Man comes out of the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 7:13. That's where the Son of Man gets their title. And so we see about the Son of Man coming down out of the heavens to earth. You constantly see that in the Bible, about God moving from the heavens onto the earth. It's not about the earth moving up to the heavens, it's about the heavens coming down to earth. It's about God coming down to us here on this earth. And so that's what we see in this first section of this scripture. Then we move on to the second part of the scripture reading, verses 28 through 31. So let's dig into that a little bit. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So leading up to the context of this piece of scripture, Jesus had cursed the fig tree, and now the fig tree is kind of getting a resurgence, kind of being rehabilitated. We see that Jesus is using the fig tree as a symbol of something else. So it talks about the lesson of the fig tree is that when we notice that the blossoms, the leaves are coming up from the fig tree, we know summer is near, kind of going on the cycle of the life of a fig tree. And he's using that as thinking about the kingdom, the emergence of a new season, an emergence of God's work here on this earth, God's presence on this earth. And you see a focus on seeing. And I think that's a consistent thing throughout this scripture reading is seeing. Now the Gospel of Mark, here's another interesting thing, has two different words for seeing. There is the physical act of seeing, so being able to see versus being blind. And that is different from the word that is used here. The Greek word is orao, and it is less about the physical ability to see, but it's more about the perception. It's about to be able to perceive, to notice. It's about spiritual and intellectual perception. And so I think that's an important aspect to know about what the writer of Mark means by seeing. It's not the ability to see. We hear that with listening. Are you hearing me or are you listening to me? There's also a difference in seeing. Are you seeing me or are you seeing me? Are you perceiving what is happening or are you seeing me? So I think it's important that we really realize that it's about perception, it's about noticing, and that will change, I think, how we understand what is being told here in the Gospel of Mark. And then we go on to the third section, starting with verse 32. But about that day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey, when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. Therefore, keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight or at cockcrow or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake. So in the previous section, section 2, we see about a consistency. The leaves come constantly and we know summer is near, so it's a consistency. Here, as one scholar's pointed out, we see a difference. We see the consistency going to a journey which is inconsistent. We don't know when the master's coming back from the trip. We don't know when God will arrive. It's a mystery. And so the writer Mark says to keep awake. And again, this is about seeing. You can't see if you're asleep. You have to be awake. You have to keep awake. You have to stay engaged and perceptive of what's going on in the world around you. You have to make sure you're doing your job. You're doing what you've been told to do, and in that way you will be rewarded when the owner of the place comes back. And we will be rewarded when the Son of Man returns, because you are living out what has been told that you need to do. And so this keep alert is really the key here. What do you have to do to keep alert? What do you have to do to see even? What do you have to do in order to make sure that you are following what God has told you to do, what God has told us to do? How do we make sure that we don't fall asleep at the wheel? How do we stay awake consistently throughout our life? Because we have to be on guard for when the Son of Man will come. I think this whole scripture is about seeing. And so I encourage you to do some more digging, do some more thinking about apocalyptic literature. We'll get into that in the application points here in just a moment. But I think there's so much to dig into. It's hard to go in a 15-minute video to go into everything that is offered here. But I think knowing about apocalyptic literature, knowing about seeing, about the ability to perceive and notice, not just to see. And then the third thing is to keep alert. How are we keeping alert? And how are we making sure that we're doing what God has told us to do so that we stay ready for when God's return to earth will occur, when the beloved community will become a reality here on this earth. So that's what we need to dig into and think more about. And for the third reading, I simply want to read the scripture again and allow everything we've talked about, allow what you have perceived, allow what you have seen to influence this hearing of the third reading of this scripture. Use your imagination, allow your imagination to guide you, and just follow along with this third reading of scripture. But in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that the summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But about that day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on watch. Therefore, keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake. Before we close, I want to make sure we get some application points so that we can continue the study of this scripture. There's a lot to study in this piece of scripture. And so here are some of the questions I'm going to put forward to you so that you can take on to study throughout this week. If you want to go in a totally different direction, that's totally fine, but here's some points that might help direct you in a direction. First thing, read this passage until you know it well enough to be able to recite it in your own words. How does the meaning change as you know it in a deeper way? Really take some time to dig into this scripture and know this scripture and see how it changes for you. The second application point is to read other pieces of apocalyptic literature in our Bible, such as Isaiah 13 and 34, Ezekiel 32, Joel 2. You can even read the book of Revelations. What are the differences and similarities to Jesus' vision here in this scripture? Also, how might Jesus' revelation speak to our world today? When we realize that apocalyptic literature speaks to an audience that's reading it, how, even though we're far removed from the historical context of this literature, what would it mean for Jesus' vision to take place in our day? What might that say about our world here today? And the third point of application is, how can we perceive God's activity in the world? What are we looking for? How are we able to be sure we keep alert and see things taking place? So what do we have to do to be able to make sure that we are seeing the world, that we're paying attention to the signs of the world, that God is here with us, bringing something new into this world, that God's work is still going on in this world? What do we have to do to see and also to keep awake? What do we have to do to make sure that we are able to see and also stay awake so that we are not ignoring or not being able to see what's happening in the world around us? So what do we need to do to be able to see and to stay awake? I know this is a lot for this week. There's a lot to dive into. I encourage you just to, if anything else, just read the scripture over and over and do as much research as you want. Do as much prayer reading of the scripture as you would like. Also, just try to just think about how the scripture reading pertains to our world. If you do just that, then you'll start to create a personal and intimate understanding of the scripture. But I know this is a confusing and a deep scripture to read. So I encourage you to really be brave and courageous in digging into the scripture this week. I hope that you all have a great Thanksgiving, and I look forward to seeing you on the first Sunday of Advent this Sunday. Until then, I wish you the best, and my prayers are with you.